All right, welcome to another episode of the Local Government Insights Podcast, modernizing government leadership, your source and insight for local government technology. My name is Brendan Milton. I'll be your host today, and today we have with us Vidhu Shekhar. How are you?
Doing good, Brennan. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. So, real briefly before we jump right in, for those listening, Vidhu is a seasoned executive in technology and strategy with a focus on public sector digital transformation. Throughout his career, he has successfully worked for government agencies, consulting firms, and enterprise companies, delivering enterprise value to customers, and currently works at Microsoft. Uh, he recently wrote a book called Generative Artificial Intelligence Use Cases in State and Local Governments. This book provides really groundbreaking insight that explores the numerous ways in which AI can be harnessed by government entities at the state and local levels to better enhance their operations and services. So I know we got a lot to cover today. Let's jump right in. I just want to start out really by what inspired you to write the book, and could you just discuss a little bit about it in its entirety, and we'll jump right into a number of sections that we talked about in our pre-interview.
Sure. Really, to think about holidays last year, right? OpenAI and ChatGPT was just coming up in the news, and especially in the early part of the year as well. And I started playing along with it, right? Curiosity did get the best of me. And as it was going along, it was interesting experience was because a lot of people were trying that, right? During the day, the availability wasn't there. And so I would be spending a lot of time in the evenings, going through and writing this. And then, of course, given my own background and a decade and a half plus of experience in government, my focus was around how this technology can be leveraged in government, right? And so, funny story is, my wife's like, if you're going to spend all this time, you might as well write a book on it. So that was really the genesis of this. And I took her counsel very seriously, right? Like most of us do. And so I essentially tried to wrap my brain around what are the different pieces in government, the different functions that can leverage this technology. And not just generative AI, but all the whole spectrum of AI tools and technologies that's been out there, right? And I only went a layer deep. I didn't go very deep. And I wanted to have sort of this almost precursor view to start thinking about how we could start thinking through the use cases that are there in the various departments and functions.
That's awesome. And I do want to talk about some of the specific areas you cover in the book. But today, if I could do a little bit of an informal agenda, I'd love to dive a little bit in terms of some of the barriers to the industry and talk about some of the recent policy work and some of the recent policy things that have been in the news as we get a little bit later on. So, first and foremost, I think you kind of even start the book out with talking about getting started with AI in government. Not a lot of published work out there, to be honest with you, on the topic, and given avenues in the business of serving local communities and states with their various solutions. For government leaders that are listening to this today, that are trying to and eager to embrace AI, you talk about roughly 3 to 5 steps that you would recommend they take to help to start with initiating an AI project. What are those, and could you talk about how to get started?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And this is a crucial time for governments because for the first time, I think, when it comes to technology, governments are not going to be laggards. Rather than they're going to be at the leading edge when it comes to adoption and really looking at just all of the artificial intelligence technology to really supercharge service delivery for all of us, right? You and I as constituents, that's the core. Uh, the first step, I think, first step is just taking inventory, right? Where are we? And knowing that almost sort of a self-assessment is going to be critical, both on the systems side, but more crucially on the data side, right? And really understanding what types of data is out there, what types of data is already in the public domain that can be very easily leveraged within the bounds of the security and controls that are going to be essential for this technology to function appropriately, right? A commonly used phrase in any sort of digital transformation is change management, right?
Yes.
And being able to put that on the forefront of making sure that the state and local workers can work together with the technology. And we are really looking to use the technology to augment the services they provide rather than use that as a replacement component, right? So that sort of business process mapping is going to be very crucial. And then I think the final phase of this is really going to be, let's iterate. Let's not wait and keep waiting to a point where the technology matures and then governments become laggards, especially at the local level, because there is so much constituent engagement,
Yes.
as well as at the state level, where system complexities are just massive. We have to start small and we have to iterate for us to be successful collectively, not just as government leaders, but also you and I as vendors, as well as constituents who get these services. We should all be willing to iterate on this and provide our feedback in a
Yes.
very open and transparent way.
That's great. It's a great framework, first of all, and I'm super excited. And it's refreshing to hear you say that. Probably one of the first times that we'll see that governments aren't laggards a little bit when it comes to adoption and change and embracing technology, right? So it's a great framework. Thanks for sharing that. And I know it's not a one size fits all like you and I talked about before.
Yes.
You certainly have to take your own specific inventory, come up with a process, figure out use cases that you can test and iterate on to refine them, and then embrace that change and process as this whole industry evolves over the next 5, 10, couple of decades. So it's a great framework.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, I know immediately people go to, well, how do I be responsible? Where is my data going? How am I using it? Security. And I know we'll talk about some of these things in a little bit more depth later, but in the context of state and local governments, at the forefront, what does responsible AI really mean? And can you share some specific use cases where responsible AI is crucial, such as like safety, security, public trust, some of those things I mentioned a minute ago?
Yeah. No, Brennan, one of the things I'm going to start off with, right, is the lens of responsible AI needs to be across everything we do with AI. And that's very important because if you think about some of the core principles, right, and different companies have a slightly different lens, but I'm going to try to bubble it all the way up to NIST
Mm-hmm.
has recently published an AI standard, AI
Yeah.
101, which is their risk management framework. And I see a lot of overlap even in my day job with Microsoft and their responsible AI framework and the NIST framework. And it really goes around the key notions around just fairness, right? Reliability, safety, security, privacy, inclusiveness, and making sure things are transparent. How does the AI system actually work? And how are we holding ourselves and the AI system accountable, right? So, at a high level, these principles need to be put on a lens of every single use case. It does specifically become very, very important for us when there is an immediate impact on a human, right? And I specifically call out that use case because if we let AI determine everything, whether it's an eligibility system or whether it's food stamps or benefits, or in public safety and justice, right? We look at predictive policing use cases, right? And if we just let AI make those determinations, we tend to put ourselves in a place where the conscious and unconscious biases in the training of that AI system may result in inadvertent impacts on the general population. And that's really the key piece is through the lens of responsible AI, how do we make sure that we always have a human in the loop, right? And make sure that we are augmenting human capability rather than just looking to replace human capability.
It's great. And I can't help but think with so much at stake, it's obviously, and you just talked about it, it's critical when we start talking about implementation of it. And we'll talk about that even more so in just a second. But with so much at stake, it's critical that we all ensure that AI is used responsibly and that human judgment remains at the core of the entire decision-making process. But AI allows us to get from point A to point B faster, more efficient, and shortens that cycle. But the human feedback loop and decision making loop has to be intertwined as we use AI to help with decision making in other areas.
Absolutely. I do also want to highlight one more thing, right? there's so many use cases out there where a decision is not being made, where we are either looking for information, we're looking for content, or we're trying to validate the content and our thinking as constituents with the government service being offered. And those, I think, will be the primary cases where we should get started, like yesterday, right? And get these technologies going, because then we can actually see the real time impact of these technologies working.
It's great. So we talked about getting started in some of those steps, responsibility. So I feel like we've laid the groundwork for what I want to talk about next is timing and some of the barriers and optimism for adoption in general. But before you go into specifics, from your perspective, and I asked you this in our prior conversation, but why do you think we're experiencing such significant advancements in AI now rather than a decade or even 2 decades ago? Like, what factors, in your opinion, have contributed to the current state, which feels like in the last 8 to 10 months, even 12 months? I mean, just this rapid hockey stick up and to the right at a scale at which we have not seen yet. Why now? Why not a decade ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. And it was one of the first questions I was thinking about as well, right? You know, I think the notion of artificial intelligence and machine learning has really been around since the 50s, believe it or not, right?
Mm.
And if you think about it, right, even when in the 2000s we were coming in, the big concern in technology was not about artificial intelligence. It was about Y2K, right? And I
Mm.
really think, I mean, to your point, like it's really the last 5 years where we've seen this like hockey stick spike around deep learning, around neural networks, and things like that. I think it's really, and you know, you'll see this in popular media as well as in documented studies. It comes down to three big things, right? Cheap storage. And
Mm.
I think about cheap storage, you know, a 786 computer was a megabyte or a couple of megabytes or 256 megabyte, I think, the
Sure.
most you
Yeah.
get, right? Even a couple of years ago or 5 years ago, getting a 512 GB hard drive, external hard drive, was still expensive. But now,
Mm.
when you and I walk into a conference, vendors are giving out 10 GB pen drive because it's so cheap. I mean, it's a security risk. Don't get
Sure.
me started on that, but it's become that cheap. The second piece of it is compute itself is becoming more affordable, right? And the amount of semiconductor technology advancements that's out there, our phones that we use are way more powerful than computers, and perhaps even the first few supercomputers that were out there, right? So there's the amount of
Yeah.
compute that's required to run these models is massive, but that's now becoming available as well and accessible. It's not just limited to, let's say, DoD level or large federal national security type installations. The final thing, you and I don't need to be programmers to be able to converse
Sure.
with ChatGPT or any like technology. Natural language processing has made all of these technologies accessible to everyone, right? It's not about ones and zeros. It's about, hey, ChatGPT, this is what I would like to do, or make me an image of this, right? You can do that with Bing, you can do that with other technologies out there. And that is not limited to English either. And this is where I think the turning point is going to be around making this more accessible. These are the
Mm-hmm.
three big things I really think that has really helped turn and pivot that onto us being able to leverage this technology. Perhaps the only other piece I would add, and this is not technology related as well, this is just human mindset, I believe, is us coming through the pandemic, right? We have
Mm.
adopted this culture of change and the notion that we
Love it.
got to move fast and innovate fast. We saw it happen when it came to vaccines. We saw it happen to our response. We saw it happen to our economic recovery towards the end of the pandemic, right? And I think that
Yeah.
notion of innovation has transcended industries.
It certainly changed the way we think about innovation and the life cycle and what we would essentially push the realm of what's possible almost. And COVID pushed us in that direction. Some would argue there's pros and cons to that, but we won't get into that today.
Yes, absolutely.
But
There's
I'm glad
pros
you
and cons
mentioned
to
it.
everything, for sure.
100%. 100%. So a couple things stand out for me. We're at the intersection of cheap storage, compute power, and natural language models and their development of them. But you went somewhere where I want to talk about just for a few minutes before we move to the next section is it was inclusivity and accessibility. And I'd love to hear your perspective on, like, specifically for governments, and that's what we're going to talk about today, right? Is how can AI help them provide accessible services to constituents regardless of their background, regardless of their ethnicity, and how AI is helping shorten that gap. That doesn't depend on region, doesn't depend on background, doesn't depend on language specifically or culture, right? It's wrapping all those up into one accessible platform or platforms that are enabling governments to allow and increase the inclusivity that they approach their communities with.
No, and if you think about what the mission of governments in general is, it's to provide exceptional services to all constituents, right?
Yes.
Across a variety of things. Typically, when we think about the risk of AI, and I'm going to balance the risk and reward part of it, is the models that AIs get trained on inherently bring biases with them. The number one reason why this technology can be successful in government is to actually overcome some biases as well in that service delivery, right? And we have to be very conscious. This is where I think the responsible AI lens comes in as well. But really, a lot of regulation in terms of accessibility has come about because somebody's not able to do something, right? When we look at the early web standards that had come along, not a lot of things were accessible. Even now, government websites struggle with making sure that they are accessible to either visually impaired or otherwise, other impairments, right? And this service transcends. Language is a simple thing. Translation services. Those are very easy, and low-hanging fruit use cases where I think government can adopt these things, especially in generative AI, because you don't necessarily have to pre-program this. Large language models like ChatGPT have this built in. And you could start typing away in Spanish and submit a question, and it will give you back the answer in Spanish without you having to have that translated set ready to go. It can go back and look at PDFs, image content, right? The multimodality of GPT-4 can really help accelerate that journey where if somebody, if I'm coming in and I'm a Japanese speaker and I have no idea what is there in that English form, but I can just be like, hey, I need to fill out this form, and GPT can ask me back, ChatGPT can ask me back in Japanese if I'm typing it in Japanese, what needs to be there. And the reason I bring up Japanese is because in my book, I wrote a little dedication to my kids who are multilingual, and Japanese is another language they speak. And I actually have an English section and a Japanese section. And then when I ran it by my wife, who's a native Japanese speaker, she's like, this was actually pretty good and very close to what native speakers would do.
And you got one there before I did. I was going to ask you at the end, but I might as well ask you now. You had to have used it, ChatGPT or an AI app, to write portions of the book, right, to help scale some of the writing, right? I would think you would have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, and which is why if you go onto Amazon and look at the listing, I have added ChatGPT OpenAI as one of my co-authors. And the reason I wanted to highlight that was because, especially in academia and education, there's a lot of controversy around this, right?
Yeah, there is.
And I mean, think about the notion of Copilot, right? Think about the notion of what started off with the printing press or maybe a typewriter, right? Typewriter helped people write faster. And then when Word came along or other word processing software, it kept helping people. I think we're going to get to a point where these technologies are just going to become little helpers and virtual assistants to us. And we're not going to be scared about leveraging them. And we would be very open about leveraging them and being able to still go through the motions as, just content creators, if you will.
Which is awesome because it leads me to what I wanted to chat with you about next is as AI becomes more societal norm, right? The immediate response for lots of folks is, what about jobs? What about public policy? How does it influence public policy? And you talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to get more specific in a second. But immediately, one of the main concerns that's raised is how is AI going to replace jobs? Could you talk a little bit about some of the insights you found and your perspective on how do you visualize the impact on jobs by AI?
It's top of mind for everyone. And in fact, if we would have had this podcast last week, I would have pulled in slightly different references. But because we're doing it this week, I'm going to pull in the latest reference of Sam Altman's testimonial to Congress.
Yes.
Right? And there were a handful of takeaways, including the first: yes, jobs are going to be impacted, right? And if you think about it, with any new technology, jobs have been impacted. A really good example that I like to give is when New York fire stations brought in automobiles, horses lost their job, right? But what did that do? And horse carriers also lost their job. It created a net new industry, and that's what we're going to see some of it, right? Is transactional work is likely to get impacted. But in the same notion, new jobs might be created to support the larger AI industry. New skills will be needed, like prompt engineering, to be able to support, all the occupations. It's almost like office skills. Every student needs to learn office skills. It might become something as prevalent as that.
Correct.
I do not want to say that it's going to be a one for one, jobs lost versus jobs created.
Certainly not balanced all the time.
And I'm not an economist to say exactly what that balance is going to be, but it's not
Right.
going to be balanced for sure. One of the other key takeaways from Sam Altman's testimonial to Congress was really around regulation. And especially in recent history, he's perhaps one of the first technology leaders to actually admit to the fact that, yes, regulation is needed when it comes to AI.
Yeah.
And I would agree that regulation is needed. But let's be real. Innovation thrives in a free market economy, right? And so we do not want to go down a path where we overly regulate it. But yes, we want to regulate something. And I believe that the analogy used was similar to how FDA regulates drug innovation, right? Where it does not completely stifle out the innovation, but it has guardrails on something that can be potentially having negative impacts.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's perhaps a great model to follow.
Yeah. He talked a lot. Sam Altman did in his recent testimonial to Congress he talked a lot about the balance between under-regulation and over-regulation. And he was first to say, without even being prompted, I don't know what that balance is just yet. I'm just making it known that there's got to be a balance, but he's promoting how intentional we should be about regulations, because as you pointed out, and he said it, regulations are needed. When regulations are identified and implemented, they still need to promote innovation,
right?
While also the end game being protecting individuals and societies from what he called potential harms of the technology itself, if not regulated and taken close look, and iterative regulation, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So he's talked a little bit about not being rigid with regulation, but being iterative and paying attention to how it's going to evolve. But we need to be aware and be intentional now before it gets out of hand,
Yep.
right?
Yep. And it is a shift in the way we have approached public policy in this country at all levels, at federal, state, and local level. Because if you think about large transformative regulations at the federal level, have typically been extremely reactive. Something has gone wrong, right? I mean, look at Dodd, you look at things happening right now in the banking industry, right? things coming out of 2008. Uh, all of those have been extremely reactive. And I think the balance that Sam Altman really refers to is let's not be reactive. We know the technology is here. We know this technology is not going to go away because it's taken us a long time to get here. And there is a lot of benefits to this technology. But on the same hand, there's
Yeah.
a lot of drawbacks and bad actors. There's always bad actors, right? Bad
Yes.
actors will use this technology for their benefit, not for societal benefit. And that's where we need regulations the most, is to limit the impact of bad actors being able to use this technology.
It's perfect. Well, I want to shift a little bit, if that's okay, to we've talked about a little bit of the guardrails that need to be in place and the harms and the potential challenges and all the things we need to consider around regulation up until now. But I want to shift and talk about some of the positive things, a lot of the positive things, and specifically use cases for our audience, all right, state and local officials. I want to lead you a little bit here, but I want to talk about IT specifically to begin with, and we can get into some of the other areas you described and share with me even that I learned on our prior talk was, can you share some of the examples you found or see how AI is supercharging the IT side of state and local?
It's the one that's being talked the least generally in popular media. But if you think about it, all state and local entities, even federal entities, right, struggle to keep up with technology and are in massive technology debt because they just don't have the large number of resources required to maintain these systems and upgrade them and do all of that. And with technologies leveraging generative AI, whether it's GitHub, Copilot, or other like technologies, right? Um, being able to reverse engineer mainframe
Hmm.
code and understand what the business rules are, being able to generate net new code and say, hey, I am going to be, I need to solve for this. Give me code that solves for this without having to know the language, being able to translate between different programming languages, right? That capability is going to be game changing. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't think the notion of being under budget and being within the schedule exists in most technology projects when it comes to the public sector.
Yes.
I think that is going to change drastically. I think the trifecta of cost, quality, and time is going to be adhered to massively by leveraging this technology. Right. I almost
Hmm.
envision scenarios where we are able to do mainframe upgrades and technology, legacy technology transformation in a matter of months instead of years,
Man.
because that's continuum changes. Right. We're able to look at one, modularizing it. And these are not net new concepts. These concepts have been around for a
Sure.
while, right? The whole notion of moving to agile and scrum based approaches have been there for a while. But really, this AI technology around code generation, code
Yes.
review, testing, all of those is going to accelerate our development capabilities.
Right. And what does that do to the budgets at the local level? What does that do to the quality of output and the infrastructure they're able to build or establish or reinforce? And before we go into some of the other areas that you talked about, and I'll mention them again in a second, but like traffic management and fire and criminal investigation, I do want to talk about this in a second. But because I went there, what how do you foresee cybersecurity specifically within the IT conversation as it pertains to incident reporting and data gathering and identification and response to threats and inbound inquiries? What's your take on that?
But there's a role for AI in all of those things. And especially because you think about it, right? And we were talking a little bit about bad actors earlier, right?
Yeah.
In cybersecurity, the threat landscape is continuously evolving. And it's not just individual bad actors, it's sometimes state sponsored activities that have also resulted, right? And so the more attacks we get, our defenses need to be bolstered up as well. And this is where generative AI and AI in general can really help provide a couple of different things. One, identification of threat patterns. Are they originating from the same place? Are they doing the same things that they were doing? Right? Identifying what loopholes might we be creating internally. Of course, I mean, there are tools being built right now across different companies to help accelerate threat identification, threat documentation, right? Being able to get those incident responses filled out fast, get it completed fast, put it in back into the monitoring systems, right? So all of those are going to become highly relevant. And it's one of those things, right? The more we advance with technology in terms of innovating, the more we need to advance in technology in terms of protecting the data as well.
Yes. Yep.
So that's where I think the balance will be. And it's an exciting time to be in security because security has become pervasive.
Yes.
And think about it like this: like you and I talk about security because we work in security, but there
Yes.
are folks that now know that social engineering scams are out there. They've got nothing to do with security, but when they see a spam call, they know something's going on.
Yes.
They are aware of that, and that fundamental awareness has come down to just general population, right? And I think AI is going to just help accelerate that because now they don't need to be looking out for context. We will be able to enable for them as service providers and vendors. If you get a call, this number has already been tagged in different places.
Right. Right.
But now here's the challenge, and this is what you've probably seen in the news media. Bad actors are using this to come up with new ways to scam people.
So
And so
there's two
that
sides to every coin.
it's the same story in Catch Me If You Can. You
Yeah.
gotta try to keep staying ahead of those
Yes.
bad actors.
And I think and that's what we're going to leave the audience with today is how do governments, like you talked about, not be laggards when it comes to this go round and be proactive because you're going to almost be required to, and it's going to force you to engage and embrace if you don't proactively do it, unfortunately. Um,
Absolutely.
so before we move on to the last couple of topics, staying with this one real quick, I want to stay here because I found our conversation prior to enlightening when it came to some of the other use cases you talked about, like traffic management,
Hmm.
fire management, criminal investigation, streamlining permitting and like licensing processes. And you don't have to go too deep into all of those, but I found my mind even being expanded when I start thinking about how AI is going to impact so many different local government functions. Um, and you brought up some interesting points. Any thoughts there? And could you share a couple use cases?
This was exactly the reason I ended up writing this book is because there's just so many little use cases across these different functions, right? And so I was at ITS America a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe, and we were talking about traffic management use cases. And so we did a little bit of a demo in my day job, right? And it was really around, I mean, when you are in a traffic management center, right? And if you're a traffic operator, there's a lot of things happening, right? And there's big binders of traffic manuals, hundreds of pages, thousands of pages.
Yeah.
And when something happens, if there's a crash, let's say I'm here in Sacramento, so I'm going to take I-80 for an example, right? If a crash happens on I-80 between a couple of exits, unless you're a seasoned operator, you do not know which manual it is and under which section and where
Mm,
to go look for it.
mm.
Right. So there's a little bit of a learning curve, which is why traffic responses to crashes are always a little bit more on the laggard side, right? It takes a little bit of time. So what we were trying to demo was essentially a generative AI virtual assistant where you feed in this information, you let it parse through manuals beforehand. And so it kind of has that repository. And then in real time, tell him there's a crash that's on lane 3 between exit A and exit B. What scenario should I go to?
Yeah.
A matter of milliseconds, it can come up with the exact scenario.
Wow.
It can tell you why it's come back with that exact scenario with the citations. Like, this is where the power comes in. And this is where the human in the loop factor comes in. Because then, me as a traffic operator, I can go look up that specific scenario, be able to quickly validate it because I'm already, an expert at this. I just needed to go find it fast enough, and then be able to actually say, hey, okay, this is good. Now push this out to the right people, right? Enable the right first responder services, enable all of that if it's not already been, or help coordinate it. And that's where the other components of AI technology and automation can come in as well.
Fascinating.
So that was around, traffic management. Permitting, I mean, think about how many times you and I have questions around, okay, I want to dig up my front yard, but I don't know if there's a pipe down there. And you're dialing 811 and probably on hold for 15 minutes before you can even talk to someone.
That's
And
right.
then you gotta explain to them, right? Or any 311 system out
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be great if I could just be like, okay, I am here, drop the pin, and I'm doing work in this part of my yard. Take a picture. Let AI do all of the work around where actually it is from a geolocation standpoint, right? You have the parcel boundaries. It can kind
Yeah.
of figure out where you are and then communicate appropriately based on available data sets
It's
to then
amazing.
tell you if there is something at which depth it is, or at least give that information to the call center agent while you're still on the call without having to wait,
Mm,
right?
fascinating.
Again, I think the possibilities are endless when it
Yeah.
comes to enabling this type of a component, right? Because again, it's the multimodality. It's not just about text. It's not just about being able to communicate. It's about the imagery as well.
Hmm.
What is the data, rich data contained in that imagery, right? That can be then used to provide that service back. And this is where I think there's other capabilities as well when you think about uh, housing assistance, for example,
Yeah.
right? Or being able to do taxes. That was another one of my favorites. We all probably went through tax season, in different levels of experience. But tax code is a mystery, and being able to understand what each of those things mean, even before I can go to my CPA and accountant and actually have them do the expert work.
Yeah.
To be honest, leverage ChatGPT to understand some of the, like, tax credits I personally might be able to be eligible for, and what would be
Same.
the criteria.
I personally use it this year to help with some of the inputs that I fed my CPA
Yeah,
around some of the tax benefits or credits or some of the information that I needed to present, given a kind of investment property portfolio that's growing on my personal family. And how do it was the first time I'd filed underneath that circumstance. So I
right.
used it to help me educate me versus typing into Google and you get all these different articles and it's nested in one paragraph at the bottom that you need. It fed me almost exactly what I needed. And I took that information. It was just a small tweak at the end. Like you said, you need a human centric approach. You can't just take it for what it's worth. But it was 95% of the way there with the data that I gave it. My CPA helped clarify that, which is the human centric
Yes.
input,
Yeah.
and got me to 100%. And it shortened that gap of what I needed to do and potentially holes or gaps in my
Absolutely.
filing. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and think about it. Like, it saved not just you time, but your CPA time and the back and forth. Like, this could have been like a 3-trip conversation where every
Mm-hmm.
time you would go back, the CPA might have more questions for you to come back and answer,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, think about the impact of this. Because you're able to file the right way, what does it do to the workload at IRS? And what does it do to the expedient way they can actually issue either refunds or collect the revenue?
Or collect. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
So again, when you look at the whole life cycle of a process, this is where I think we can accelerate the life cycle of all
Yes.
of these different government processes very significantly.
Yes. Yes. I love it. It's fascinating. I mean, even the avenue who sponsors this show is beginning already and has already done so, integrating AI into some of its technology, like some of our short-term rental solutions, like not only web scraping, but the analysis of the data paired with the jurisdictional data has provided instant insight into identifying properties that governments are unaware of, are not
Yes,
licensed, immense revenue stream that are being missed by certain governments because they just don't have access to the data and can't digest and understand it in a way that is actionable, if you will.
yeah,
So
yeah. And
fascinating.
this is where I think you bring up a very crucial point, right? the way we leverage this technology takes us away from just bringing data together, but it also helps us actually get to the decisions faster,
Yes.
right? And that's where I think the key piece becomes, especially when you are able to train the models to get to that decision faster. That's going to be the key. The other piece I want to make sure I highlight is it's not just the glamorous constituent facing services that can leverage this technology. Creating budget books, going through procurement, all of those functions
Yes.
have a use case embedded in them where generative AI and artificial intelligence can be leveraged, right? And I am sure if there's any of our CPA or government finance officers listening to this call, they are going to have a lot of value that they can derive in actually being able to do the analysis and strategic amount of work rather than be mired in just going through their favorite tool, Excel spreadsheets, before they end up building out these budget books.
It's fascinating stuff. So before we wrap with sort of a summary, and I want to get your take on one more area, and that is the proposed moratorium. So we went kind of establishing foundation. What do we do to establish guardrails and responsible AI and steps to take to implement? We talked about specific use cases that it's already applicable to in government. But before we end today, there's been, and most have heard, and if you have not heard, it's a 6-month moratorium that a lot of the top tech executives have come together to talk about how AI systems with human competitive intelligence could pose, like we talked about earlier with Sam Altman, profound risk to society and humanity. And advanced AI could ultimately sort of represent a profound, as it states in the moratorium, a profound change in the history of life on Earth. Pretty drastic comment, right? So not to be too doom and gloom, but I wanted to get your take on this idea of implementing kind of 6 months. We talked about the hockey stick earlier and how fast we've gone from almost inception to development and the scale at which it's moving right now. They're saying, hold up, we need to catch back up even right now, even as early as we are. We need to pause some of the development here and look at how fast it's come already. And what do we want to do about that regulation that we talked about earlier? So I'm kind of pulling it all together to talk about what's your take on the moratorium, and do you think it's feasible? What would it do? And do you think it would be realistic that would come to fruition?
And let me just first start off with a legal disclaimer. These views are just personally mine, right? When I saw that first come about, and especially looking at the major authors, I was surprised because those were the same people that were trying to take us down a path of a full self-driving car, which would essentially be leveraging AI, right? And yes, we haven't gotten there yet, but when you think about people who were championing this technology, asking for a moratorium because they are not there yet, and essentially waiting for the market to stop so that they can catch up, I kind of find that hypocritical almost, right? And so my view is, yes, we need to be careful on how we are advancing this technology, but we won't even know how to regulate it if we don't test it in a test environment, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the key for us, from my point of view, is we need to be able to test it in a safe environment. And absolutely, that's the lens of responsible AI. And so did I freeze up? Are you able to?
Okay, it did for just a moment. I think you're back now. You're
Okay,
good.
perfect. All right. So yeah, that's why I was gonna say is like, hey, great. The moratorium is probably gonna be not really enforced, because if you think about it from the government lens, they want to regulate it, but they don't want to stifle innovation, right? And especially at the federal level, the conversation's really shifting very fast to, does US maintain their leadership position when it comes to technology, right? If we even think about a moratorium. And so that's where I think the key becomes in terms of advancement is, let's keep advancing, but let's make sure we are advancing it from a very safe and responsible lens.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, this has been incredible. Take us home, Vidhu, by just summarizing, I feel like these four main points have kind of been interwoven through all of our discussion today in different areas we've addressed, and they are certainly major pillars in your book. But can you just take us home by summarizing some of the four main capabilities of AI as you establish in your book and have talked about a little bit today? Is the creation of content, summarizing that content, developing code, and producing imagery. Talk about those just a little bit in summary, and we'll wrap.
No, thank you, thank you. And really, the lens around this is around generative AI, right? And when we think about creating new content, this is really where it's helping you get over the writer's block, right? And be able to start off from a point or continue forward from a point, especially when you think about the amount of standard operating procedures or training manuals we create in government, right? This is where I think this theme comes in most handy. Summarizing content, this is exactly where we started off the conversation from a constituent service standpoint, right? Being able to have chatbots, being able to have knowledge assistants, virtual assistants. This is where this thematically carries forward. Developing code, this is where the IT folks are going to be the most happy because it's going to give them the ability to do so much more and be able to do so much more in different languages and different application stacks without having to learn them all from the ground up. It accelerates their own learning curves when it
Yeah.
comes to technology. And then finally, I mean, producing imagery, I would take that even a step further, right? Producing videos, animations, and all of that can start from simple tools like DALI or Mid Journey AI. I mean, there's a whole bunch of tools out there that at a prompt will give you imagery, right? Or you can use existing imagery and augment it. I mean, I think Adobe's even come out with products that make it seem like Photoshop was from the 90s. I mean, it is from the 90s, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
uh,
wild.
the
Mid
technology
journey,
is so
another
much
one.
more advanced. So yeah, I think those four themes are going to be highly relevant, and we should look at those four themes and drill down across each function of government on how those four can be implemented.
Couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. Well, thank you, Vidhu. Thank you so much for the incredible conversation today. I could go on and on. We might even do a part two if you'll allow. But seriously, thank you for incredible conversation and feedback. Your insights have clearly been eye-opening and deeply informative. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us and for our listeners. It's clear to me and many others that I've spoken with on the local government side daily, weekly, that the future of government operations and the services that they perform will be significantly influenced by AI moving forward. For those of you looking to get started and how to use them, how to implement them in certain areas of your government, reach out to us. Let us know. Ask for use cases on how we're integrating into not only our company policies, but our products and our solutions themselves. So, Insights Podcast, Modernizing Government Leadership. Stay tuned for more local government news and insights to come. We look forward to having you next time. Thanks so much.